Hey, what's up, people? Welcome to my review and in-depth analysis for Return of the Jedi. Now, this film marks the conclusion to the original Star Wars trilogy, and I want to dedicate this video to director Richard Marquand, who passed away at a very early age. I tried to include as much information I could find in regards to his contributions to this film, because I really wanted to know a lot more about those contributions. So this film brings us to where the story began, as far as bringing back that swashbuckling goodness from the original Star Wars, mixed with a little bit of the character-driven aspects of The Empire Strikes Back. But it must be noted that George Lucas specifically wanted a film that was more in tune with that swashbuckling space opera adventure that was in the original Star Wars, and less character driven like Irving Kershner's Empire Strikes Back. But in my opinion, I feel like this film has the best of both worlds, because even though, yes, the film is more swashbuckling adventurism than, let's say, Empire Strikes Back, it still has those important character-driven moments, especially between Luke and his father. This film brings us to such an epic conclusion, and I love the way that George Lucas turned his story into a story about a son redeeming his father. Luke Skywalker redeeming Anakin Skywalker. And as George Lucas made this story up as he went along, I think it was such a great idea to end it on this note. Even though the film has its flaws, I still feel like this film has a lot of heart, and I adore this movie. So take this journey with me as we explore the themes and the making of The Return of the Jedi. The Return of the Jedi was released on May 25th, 1983. Directed by Richard Marquand and written by Lawrence Kasdan and George Lucas. It was produced by Howard Kazanjian. The Return of the Jedi truly exemplified George Lucas as a confident producer and storyteller, as his take on the hero's journey becomes truly unique with this final chapter in the original trilogy, with the great morality tale of a son redeeming his father. With Richard Marquand's enthusiastic direction and Lucas's more active participation with the making of the film, Return of the Jedi would feel more like a return to the feeling of Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers serials, which inspired the original Star Wars, when compared to the previous film, The Empire Strikes Back. Nevertheless, The Return of the Jedi would also have very deep and profound themes, with the redemption of Luke's father, and tonally would feel like a mashup of the original Star Wars' fun escapist adventure and The Empire Strikes Back character-driven film. George Lucas once again finances the film all by himself and was determined not to go over budget or fall behind schedule like what happened during the making of The Empire Strikes Back, which left him feeling exhausted and left him to reconsider making additional Star Wars films due to how challenging and laborious the whole process was in making them. The work was so consuming that he and Marcia Lucas, his wife, who made significant creative contributions to the trilogy, would end up divorcing during the making of Return of the Jedi, because she felt that Lucas was too much of a workaholic and not devoting enough time to their marriage and family life. The following quote from George Lucas after the making of Empire Strikes Back illustrates this. "I was ready to quit. I wanted to quit then, but I kidded myself into thinking that if I stopped directing, it would be like quitting. I thought I could just oversee it, but it didn't work out that way." The following quote from Gary Kurtz, producer of The Empire Strikes Back, illustrates how George Lucas was changing his mind due to the many challenges of making The Empire Strikes Back. "At that time, we were still talking about what was happening with Jedi, and it already was apparent that he was changing his mind with what he wanted to do with Jedi. Another quote from George Lucas during an interview with Time magazine illustrates just how exhausted he was from making the Star Wars saga. The sacrifice I've made for Star Wars may have been greater than I wanted. After Graffiti, Star Wars would have gone in the toilet and it wouldn't have mattered financially. It's an interesting choice I made, and now I'm burned out. In fact, I was burned out a couple of years ago, and I've been going on momentum ever since. Star Wars has grabbed my life and taken it over against my will. Now I've got to get my life back again before it's too late. It's very unfortunate that Lucas was too late, that the making of the trilogy would end with Marcia Lucas divorcing him. Further quotes from George Lucas illustrate this plight. When I was in film school, it was 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That was all I thought about and did. I didn't do anything else. Then, when I started working professionally and got married, I had to work all the time in order just to get anywhere. And I didn't have a vacation until I finished my first film and went to Europe. I had a couple of bucks in the bank and I said, it's now or never. My wife had been bugging me. I'd been at it for 4 or 5 years straight, and she said, you can't go on like this. That was in 1973. I didn't have another vacation until 1977 when I went to Hawaii after Star Wars. My wife likes to have vacations. She doesn't like not being able to go anywhere, year in and year out. She liked to be able to say, look, let's take off for 2 or 3 weeks and just cool out. So I promised her that after Star Wars, every year we'd take 2 vacations, 2 to 3 weeks each year. That lasted for 1 year. Now I try to get in one vacation a year for a week or so. It always comes down to saying, next week, just let me get past this thing. By the time you get past this thing, there's always something else and you can't leave. Now, 1983 is my goal. I intend to take off for a year, if I can, and just do nothing. And that is why I'm not planning any other projects. The following quote from George Lucas further illustrates the difficulties with making the trilogy. It's hard to describe the amount of detail, the amount of work involved. It's a 3 year deadline with 2 years of really concentrated, serious work, 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. There are periods of 4 or 5 months in those years when the work is 16 to 18 hours a day. You get not much more than 5 hours of sleep a night, and that's hard. On Sunday, you're wiped out and you're still thinking about the movie. People usually don't understand the implications of what I'm saying, living this way, day after day, but it's awesome. You can do it for a couple of months, but year after year, it gets to be grim. I've been doing it for God knows how long. It's more and more pressure, and I'm more and more unhappy, and tired, and exhausted, and dragging home endless problems at the end of the day. I'm not having much fun. It's all work. It's very anxiety ridden, very hard, very frustrating, and relentless. The extent to which one's personal life is usurped cannot be overestimated. It has made me less of a happy person than I think I could be. It has disrupted my family life. I have a wife and a 2 year old daughter, and they are the most important things in my life. My family is it for me. Amanda is 2 years old now, and she's magic. She's this little girl, and she ain't going to wait for me. She's going. She's growing. The last thing in the world I want is to turn around and have her be 18 and say, hi, Dad, where have you been all my life? George Lucas further adds, I love Star Wars. I think it's great, but I just don't want to sacrifice my entire life for it. I don't want to be an all consumed workaholic. I want to enjoy the better things in life, like a normal person. Just say, go out and stand on the hill and enjoy life. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning these quotes and bringing them to the forefront of this review is because I found it very unfortunate that George Lucas intended to return to a family life after the completion of Return of the Jedi, only for him to get a divorce from Marcia Lucas during the making of the film. And again, just like Empire Strikes Back and the conflicts that were endured during the making of that film, the conflicts that occurred during the making of Return of the Jedi contributed to the making of the film as well. Now, Return of the Jedi marks the end of Luke Skywalker's hero's journey. In the previous film, he faced a significant ordeal, trials and tribulations, when he faced Darth Vader and discovered that Vader was his father and barely survived their confrontation. This revelation resulted in a significant change and transformation for Luke, but also placed him in a major conflict, which was whether he should kill his father or not. Now Luke decides with conviction that he cannot kill his father and that he would rather die trying to save him than give in to the dark side and kill him, which ultimately becomes a period of atonement and yields great reward for him, as his act of compassion compels Vader, also in an act of compassion, to kill Palpatine. This was not only a resurrection for Luke Skywalker as being the resurrection of the Jedi, but also a resurrection for Anakin Skywalker as well. Therefore, the title, Return of the Jedi, has two meanings. It could mean Return of the Jedi in plural, with Luke representing the return of the Jedi Order, or it can mean the return of the Jedi, singular, meaning the return of Anakin Skywalker. The film then ends with both Anakin and Luke at peace with themselves, as Luke returns back to be reunited with his friends on Endor, and Anakin taking his place among his fellow comrades and friends, Obi-Wan Kenobi and Yoda, in the netherworlds as a Force ghost. Another significant change that occurred for Return of the Jedi was the departure of producer Gary Kurtz, who had produced the original Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back, and George Lucas's second film, American Graffiti. The reason for Kurtz's departure from the project were due to the responsibility of The Empire Strikes Back falling behind schedule and going over budget, falling mostly on his shoulders, and creative differences as well. An interview with Film Threat illustrates this. Film Threat: so when did you and George Lucas start to not see things the same way? What was the beginning of it? Kurtz replies, I think that was during the making of Empire. George got really concerned about how long we were taking. We didn't go over budget and he banged me for the cost overruns on Empire. And taking Irving Kershner's side. Kurtz replies, and taking Irv's side, yes. It was kind of a mutual parting. It wasn't acrimonious. It was just that he felt he would probably be more comfortable with someone else to handle the production chores on Jedi, and I felt that I would prefer a different kind of challenge that wasn't kind of repeating something I had already done. Jim Henson had asked me to produce The Dark Crystal, something he had been working on for about 10 years. In addition, Kurtz was unhappy about the ever expanding Lucasfilm Corporation and the changes that were occurring because of this. A quote from Kurtz reflects this. The saddest thing about watching that process was the slow takeover by the bureaucracy. With that slowly came this thing about dress code, company policy, and nobody talking to the press, and a firm of PR people, and it was quite frustrating, really. I was there longer than anybody and had been with him for the longest period of time, and I just felt that I didn't like it. The bureaucracy grew and grew. You couldn't talk to George. You had to talk to his assistant. It became more Howard Hughes in a way. I decided I was more interested in working on interesting films than in being tied to a machine like that. The following quote illustrates George Lucas' opinion of the matter. Gary did the best job he could. He made enormous contributions, but he was in over his head. If anybody is to blame, it's me, because I was the one who knew and stayed over here until it was too late. In addition to the issues about going over budget and falling behind schedule, there were also creative differences which led to the reason why Kurtz departed. The following quote details this. This idea that the roller coaster ride was all the audience was interested in, says Kurtz, and the story doesn't have to be very adult or interesting, seemed to come up because of what happened with Raiders of the Lost Ark and the Indiana Jones films, and the fact that that seemed to make a lot of money. The following quote also illustrates how difficult at times it was for Gary Kurtz to collaborate with George Lucas when making The Empire Strikes Back. I think that he did shaft a bit under the idea of someone saying that's not a good idea some of the time. At the very end of Empire, we decided at the very last minute we pretty much locked the picture in the mix and were just getting ready to make 70 millimeter prints, and we decided that there had to be an extra shot at the very end to identify this rebel fleet. If you remember how the end works, it's before you go into the medical department who are working on Mark's hand. It's the establishing shot of the fleet. They weren't very difficult to do, and all the ships were there. Just pile up the composites, and they were rushed through just to get it done. Very last minute. One of them wasn't particularly good, and George said, "Oh well, maybe we should just let it go." I said, "It's worth at least one more go through. One bad shot can ruin the whole movie, basically." The following quote illustrates how Gary Kurtz feels about the finished Return of the Jedi film and how things changed from the initial proposal of what the story was supposed to be. At that time of Empire Strikes Back, Lucas always said he had enough material for 3 earlier films and 3 later films to make a total of 9, and there were outline material certainly for a later 3 that culminated with this big clash with the Emperor in Episode 9. So we'll never see any of those, based on what he said now. One of the reasons Jedi came out the way it did was because the story outline of how Jedi was going to be seemed to get tossed out. And one of the reasons I was really unhappy was the fact that all of the carefully constructed story structure of characters and things that we did in Empire was going to carry over into Jedi. The resolution of that film was going to be quite bittersweet, with Han Solo being killed and the princess having to take over as queen of what remained of her people, leaving everybody else. In effect, Luke was left on his own. None of that happened, of course. Much, much less of a happy ending. It would have been quite sad and potent and upbeat at the same time because they would have won a battle. But the idea of another attack on another Death Star wasn't there at all. It was a rehash of Star Wars with better visual effects, and there were no Ewoks. It was just entirely different. It was much more adult and straightforward, the story. An interview with Gary Kurtz from Film Threat further reiterates his sentiments. So the story for Return of the Jedi was quite a bit more potent, and the ending was the coronation of Leia as the queen of what was left of her people, to take over the royal symbol. That meant she was then isolated from all of the rest, and Luke went off then by himself. It was basically a kind of bittersweet ending. She's not his sister that dropped in to wrap up everything neatly. His sister was someone else way over on the other side of the galaxy, and she wasn't going to show up until the next episode. Now, this is very interesting right here because this is corroborated in the initial screenplay that was written by Lee Brackett for The Empire Strikes Back, where Luke's sister was a character named Nelith. I believe that the reason why George Lucas decided to make Leia Luke's sister is because he was so exhausted and because he had enough of Star Wars. He wanted it to end at Episode 6. He kind of forced himself into a corner by calling A New Hope Episode 4, so he committed himself to a prequel trilogy. But I really believe that he wanted to wrap everything up in this episode, Episode 6, Return of the Jedi. So that was one of the main reasons why he chose to make Leia Luke's sister, because he really gave up on the sequel trilogy at this point. And I don't think he cared how forced it came in the narrative. He just wanted to be done with Star Wars because it took so much out of him. I mean, it sacrificed his marriage. Now, we all know that George Lucas changes his mind all the time, so obviously he changed his mind about the sequel trilogy and went ahead and wrote story treatments for those, but the ultimate change of making Leia Luke's sister was set in stone. Because at the time, he wanted to wrap up the story, he wanted to wrap up the narrative, so no matter how forced it came across, he just didn't care. He wanted to end the story. This additional quote further illustrates the disposition that Kurtz developed with George Lucas. It was just a matter of trying to get it done, and he, I suppose, wasn't very good at delegating. Sometimes he would want to control everything, and then other times he would go away and you wouldn't hear from him for a long time. It was difficult to fathom kind of how he approached all that, and he comes out of school doing everything himself. The documentary school, where he wrote and directed and shot and edited all by himself. And there's certain feature films you can make that way, and others you can't. He had a good eye, and he's a very good editor, and the films that he directed, for the most part, have a good visual sense. With story material, some of the characters were complicated, and the scripts worked well. He seemed to work best as a collaborative writer, where other writers came in and had some way in adding certain details and things so you can get a variety of point of view, like Willard and Gloria Hick on American Graffiti. The Hicks also did a polished last draft on Star Wars to add some humor and some edginess to some certain bits, and I think it helped a lot. As a result of this, Howard Kazanjian, producer of Lucasfilm's first Indiana Jones film, Raiders of the Lost Ark, would step in as producer for Return of the Jedi. In addition to Gary Kurtz not returning as producer, director of The Empire Strikes Back, Irving Kershner, also turned down the opportunity to return as director for Return of the Jedi. The following quote illustrates Kershner's reasons why. For two reasons. One, I didn't want to. Two, I was asked halfway through shooting Empire, and by that time I knew that Jedi would be a 3 year project. It took 2 years and 9 months for me to do Empire, and I didn't want to go through that again. Also, I didn't think it was good to do two for George. I didn't want to be a Lucas employee. And I read the script of Jedi, not the whole script, but a scaled down version, and I didn't believe it. In addition, other priorities were also of concern for Lucas during this time apart from making Return of the Jedi, primarily the growth of industrial light and magic and the creation of Skywalker Ranch. The following quote illustrates this. We are trying to bring in outside projects so that we can keep everyone here working. The situation for having a permanent staff on special effects is unique. The following quote from Lucas also illustrates the foreshadowing of the digital revolution which he would pioneer. We're going beyond the point of film now, says Lucas. Anybody who's worked with film, especially anybody who has edited film, realizes what a stupid 19th century idea film is. Anybody who has torn sprocket holes or tried to show a first cut knows the only thing you worry about is if the film's going to break. It's just not what you'd call a sophisticated setup. You get into video and electronic technology and you realize how sophisticated it is and how far in advance of anything in film. It's just a whole different world. Then you combine that with digital technology and it's light years ahead of even video. So while George Lucas was making Return of the Jedi, he had numerous other projects in mind. Some would view these various priorities almost as George Lucas selling out. But if Lucas was to expand his company and advance filmmaking in the way that he desired, he had to ultimately become a smart businessman in order to support his company, and in turn support the numerous creative goals that he had in mind. Therefore, the profits from the Star Wars films, such as toys and other merchandising, would have to be the driving revenue that would be generated in order to expand Lucasfilm and its other subsidiary companies. One of the most important projects that Lucas had in mind was Skywalker Ranch. George Lucas states, most of this filmmaking effort is so I can create a dream. a dream I've had for a long time, which is to build a research retreat for film. The amount of money needed to develop a facility like that is so enormous that the money I have doesn't amount to anything. You need millions and millions of dollars to build such an operation. The only way I can do that is to create a company that will generate profits. The Star Wars films are the core of Lucasfilm, which is why I have to concentrate on them. I don't want to spend the rest of my life making Star Wars pictures, but I do want them to get set up so that they'll operate properly without my having to get completely involved in all of them. They've got to be self generating to support the facility. In an interview, Lucas elaborates further. We are taking the profits from Empire Strikes Back and the next film, Revenge of the Jedi, and investing them in outside companies, then using those profits to build the ranch and maintain the overhead. What happens if the Empire doesn't make enough money for your ranch? Well, if it doesn't happen with this one and the next, then that's the end. I'm not going to spend the next 15 years of my life trying to make hit movies to get the ranch. So, with these quotes, some individuals feel that George Lucas's shifting of gears to prioritize a vision of creating Skywalker Ranch and other subsidiary companies of Lucasfilm was something like selling out because he wasn't solely focused on making a movie, on making Return of the Jedi. And as I stated in my previous analysis of The Empire Strikes Back, that was the moment where George Lucas transitioned from filmmaker to head of a corporation, for better or for worse. It all depends on your opinion. All I'm trying to say is that George Lucas is no longer merely just a film director who is concerned with good cinema. He has so many other things in mind. And this is what was going on during the making of Return of the Jedi. Furthermore, this shifting of gears from filmmaker to head of a corporation with the desire to expand the company and create all these subsidiary companies and develop Skywalker Ranch will contribute to George Lucas's different approach to filmmaking moving forward, which is to be expedient, shoot as quickly as possible, and also to save money, especially because George Lucas was financing the films all by himself. Now, in order to create revenue for these subsidiaries of Lucasfilm, George Lucas would obviously need to generate revenue, which lied more in the merchandise than it did in the film itself. The following quote from George Lucas illustrates this. In a way, this film was designed around toys, Lucas says. I actually make toys. I'm not making much for directing this movie. If I make money, it will be from the toys. I don't consider it cashing in, but I invested in a toy company operation. Also, we'll be involved with the largest toy company in the world. This could be very large. Now, this was another reason why Gary Kurtz decided to depart from Lucasfilm. The following quote illuminates more about this. I could see where things were headed, Kurtz said. The toy business began to drive the Lucasfilm empire. It's a shame. They make 3 times as much on toys as they do on films. It's natural to make decisions that protect the toy business, but that's not the best thing for making quality films. The first film in Empire were about story and character, but I could see that George's priorities were changing. The emphasis on toys, it's like the cart driving the horse, Kurtz says. If it wasn't for that, the films would be done for their own merits. The creative team wouldn't be looking over their shoulder all the time. We had an outline, and George changed everything in it, Kurtz said. Instead of bittersweet and poignant, he wanted a euphoric ending with everybody happy. The original idea was that they would recover Han Solo in the early part of the story, and he would then die in the middle part of the film in a raid on an Imperial base. George then decided he didn't want any of the principals killed. By that time, there were really big toy sales, and that was the reason. Now, I personally think it's unfair to accuse George Lucas of selling out in this regard because you have to keep in mind he is financing these films all by himself, and money does not grow on trees. Unfortunately, most of the money comes from merchandising rather than the film itself. So if you want more Star Wars movies, if you want more Star Wars material, guess what? You got to sell stuff. You have to sell product. You have to sell merchandise. If it wasn't for the selling of merchandise such as toys, we wouldn't have more Star Wars films. Now, in regards to some unfortunate events that occurred after The Empire Strikes Back, one of the main things that occurred was that George Lucas was slapped with a huge fine by the Directors Guild. The following quotes elaborates more on this. George Lucas was fined $250,000 for various infractions due to the credits on Empire, says Kazanjian. When they went to court, it came down to 25,000. In fact, it was Kirshner, a Directors Guild member, who was fined, not Lucasfilm. The guild could put nothing against Lucasfilm, but George paid that 25,000. The issue is you can't put the director's name at the end of the picture if you have George Lucas's name up front. We don't have George Lucas's name up front. We have his company name. The issue would finally be settled in Lucas's favor in November 2011. Now, George Lucas was so upset about this that he dropped out of the Writers Guild and the Directors Guild, which consequentially made it impossible for him to hire the director he initially had in mind, which was his good friend Steven Spielberg. As a result of this, the search for a director had to be initiated, which ultimately led to the hiring of up and coming director Richard Marquand. But directors that were considered and were in competition with Marquand include Richard Donner, director of Superman, Desmond Davies, director of Clash of the Titans, Hugh Hudson, director of Chariots of Fire, Terry Gilliam, known for 12 Monkeys, Richard Attenborough, who was working on Gandhi at the time, John Borman, director of Excalibur, John Carpenter, director of Halloween and Escape from New York, David Cronenberg, director of The Fly, Scanners, and Videodrome, Joe Dante, director of The Howling, Richard Lester, director of Superman 2, and Tony Scott, the brother of Ridley Scott, and who was an up and coming director. Finally, David Lynch was initially George Lucas's first pick. David Lynch, who is responsible for directing such masterpieces such as The Elephant Man and Blue Velvet. Now, I love reading about Marquand's enthusiasm to be hired as a director for the project. He seemed very passionate about wanting to make Return of the Jedi, and the following quote illustrates this. I told him that I felt seriously that I should direct this movie, and that's when George said, there are only two, one other guy and you. I'm going to have to make up my mind, and I promise to make it up this weekend. Howard Kazanjian recollects on how they initially went with director David Lynch. George called me up Saturday and said, I want to go with David, says Kazanjian. So I called David Lynch and he was thrilled, but within 3 days he declined. He was a DGA member, but he declined for other reasons. Not long afterward, David announced that he was going to do Dune. David Lynch decided he didn't want to do a George Lucas movie, says Mark Hamill. He felt he couldn't be constantly answering to another producer. George didn't want to restrict someone that original, so they came to an amiable parting of ways. The following quote illustrates just how excited and happy Richard Marquand was to receive the news that he was chosen as director for Return of the Jedi. I got a phone call from Howard Kazanjian, says Marquand, and he said, "Richard, I thought I ought to tell you. I ran into my agent's office, but he had gone to lunch. So I grabbed the first person I could find, my agent's innocent young secretary, and said, 'We're going to drink so much champagne.' We charged across the street in Century City and found a place where we could just sit in a bar and drink, and I behaved quite disgracefully. Then I found out where my agent was, burst into his luncheon in a very chic restaurant with some incredibly important East Coast lawyer. I was dressed in jeans and t-shirt, grabbed him by the shoulders, kissed him, and rushed out. Then I got in my car, weaved home to my wife in the valley, fell into the pool. Then we went out, bought another bottle of champagne, and got completely drunk. I called George and asked, 'When do I get the script?' Now, I just want to take this time to present some rare interviews from Richard Marquand, who we know very little about in the Star Wars community. Richard Marquand is entirely overlooked and he's underrated, and I want to know much more about him. So let's take this time to listen to this interview from Richard Marquand. And this is one of the main reasons why this thesis is so long, because I'm dedicating a lot of time to Richard Marquand, who I know very little about.
By the time I actually came to shoot Jedi, I knew Star Wars and Empire backwards and forwards. I knew them extremely well. And I liked the apparent naivete and simplicity with which George had made Star Wars. I liked that style very much. I found the slight, possibly over-sophistication of the slightly more filmic, more visual way in which Kirsch told his story a little bit excessive for me, for my tastes. I'm a sentimental, very emotional Welshman with a rather maddening sense of humor. I have a twinkle in my eye, and I think the previous director was a different kind of person with perhaps a deeper sense of gloom or a deeper sense of doom, and maybe slightly less sense of humor. George is a different man again, with a different kind of an attitude to relationships and so forth. Maybe a little bit more introverted, perhaps a little bit more distant, with maybe therefore a greater sense of action storyline and perhaps less interest in the way that people interact. For me, this film is about friendship and loyalty and trust and self-identification, but don't take it too seriously. Let's have a laugh about it, but when we're going to cry, let's cry, and when we're going to laugh, let's laugh. And I think that's what I guess I brought to this movie, and I like to think that's why I was asked to direct it.
You directed Anthony Daniels as C-3PO, the robot, and I'm wondering what it's like to direct a star who happens to be an inanimate object.
Tony Daniels is a brilliant actor, as you can see. His performance is amazing. His ability to express things through a completely blank sheet of metal is quite extraordinary. A lot of filmmakers have tried to copy the success of Star Wars, and most of them have missed the point, and they think that Star Wars is about sets, about rockets, about space travel, about special effects, about battles, and it isn't actually about that at all. You've got to get that all absolutely right. But once it's right, essentially you've got to forget it, and you've got to actually say, this film is about relationships. It's actually about love and hate and loyalty and fear and aggression, desire and loathing, and that's what it's about. Otherwise, you could say Hamlet's about people stalking around in black tights and having sword fights now and again, and of course it's not at all. Hamlet is actually about a kid who doesn't quite know what happened in his recent past and needs to find out, and once he's found out, wants to do something about it and can't bring himself to do something about it, which is a very taut, tense play. And similarly, our movie is actually about a kid who's not quite sure who his father is, and once he finds out is determined to do something about it. And that's why, in fact, people go back and back and back to it.
Now, compare Marquand's acceptance to stepping into the role as director of a Star Wars movie compared to Kirshner's, who ultimately had to be persuaded into doing it. I think these differences ultimately contributed to the outcome of the film and why Marquand's film feels more fun and less serious than Empire Strikes Back. Not that this is a bad thing. Howard Kazanjian recollects on the approach of finding the new director for Return of the Jedi. Since Lucas chose not to direct Return of the Jedi himself, there was an extensive search conducted for a director who would mesh well with Lucas and his approach to the film. We were looking for a director that was rather young, that was flexible, and that had not established himself as a great independent filmmaker, that would follow the tradition of Star Wars, and that would let George be as closely attached as he likes to be on these projects. In hindsight, Gary Kurtz gives his opinion of Richard Marquand's choice as director. George, I think, had in the back of his mind that the director was a sort of stand in, that he could phone him up every night and tell him what to do and kind of direct vicariously over the telephone. That never happened on Empire Strikes Back. Kirshner's not that kind of director. And when George showed up a couple of times on set, he found that it wasn't easy to maneuver Kirshner into doing what he would have done. So on Jedi, he was determined to find a director who was easy to control, basically, and he did. And that was the result, basically. The film was sort of one that George might have directed if he had directed it himself. Now, here's an interesting quote from director Richard Marquand about his approach to the filmmaking process for Return of the Jedi in comparison to the previous film, The Empire Strikes Back. I like the way George has made the three movies that he's actually directed. He's a very deceptively simple stylist. That's part of what makes Star Wars so available to children. And I wanted to go back to that sort of presentation on Return to the Jedi, rather than the highly sophisticated, sexy way in which Kirshner made Empire, which I enjoyed. I thought it looked like an incredible, glossy, glorious sort of machine, but I prefer the other way. The following quote reflects how George Lucas felt about Richard Marquand's work as a director. As George watched Eye of the Needle, he was particularly impressed with its visual style and the way Richard worked with actors, says Jim Bloom, co-producer of Return of the Jedi. Kate Nelligan and Dawn Sutherland did a great job, and it was a really exciting movie. George also knew Richard had cut his teeth on a lot of work in television. He thought Richard was a director that he would feel comfortable with, one who could understand that essentially it'd be George's movie, and because of all, he decided to meet him. In the process of seeing a lot of movies, that one jumped out, George Lucas says. I was very, very impressed with the directing. It's a very tight, very clean, strong movie with narrative, character, and just getting the most emotional value out of the concept. I'm looking for a lot of things, George Lucas says. Somebody who has a lot of technical expertise, who can get the job done, and has had enough experience to handle something this big. It's not an easy kind of movie to make, so that's a prerequisite. You'd be surprised how many directors aren't professional enough to handle something this complicated. So I showed him a few of the preliminary design sketches and we talked about them a little bit. But it was more to show him what the relationship was between him and myself, which was to say, yes, I am involved in the project, but at the same time, there are the bases that I cover, and these are the bases that you'll cover. And between us, we should survive. When we finally went up to the top secret area in the art department where Joe Johnston lives and works, says Richard Marquand, and George showed me some sketches, some aquarry drawings, I was really thrilled. I hadn't read the script, but I got this glimpse, which was nice. I felt very privileged to be shown this stuff, but there was no way I was going to make any comments on it because I thought, who am I? I'm not one of the team yet. Marquand called Kirshner, who told him, Lucas will leave you alone, more than any producer you've ever worked with. Marquand had first gained prominence internationally when his documentary Search for the Nile won 2 Emmy Awards after its U.S. broadcast in 1972. He won another Emmy with Big Henry and the Polka Dot Kid, but his production experiences since had sometimes been difficult. On the film The Legacy, Richard Marquand had a terrible experience with producers interfering with his cut of the film. He recollects, I learned that a director cannot direct a movie who hasn't got his own army, cast, and crew. Otherwise, there are all these people around ready to stab you in the back. It was a crucifying experience. He did the legacy to get into features, says Lucas. He's not too proud of it. I saw it. I wanted to see him at his worst. Considering the fact that the cast, the script, and everything were handed to him, and that he came onto the picture just a few weeks before they started shooting, directorially, what he was trying to do actually came through. Richard Marquand's son provides the following quote. Dad started out making documentaries about the Vietnam War and things like that, says James Marquand. He was quite a political guy. He saw the whole Star Wars saga as having a moral message. He said to me that the Ewoks were like the Viet Cong. One of Richard Marquand's desires was to have his longtime collaborator and editor, Sean Barton, edit the film with Marshall Lucas. Sean has cut all the major stuff that I've done, Richard Marquand says. So Sean flew out to meet George and they got on very well. The character of Sean meant a lot to him because obviously once the director delivers his cut, then the producer gets his little go at it. That's normal. It was important to George that in post he wouldn't find a guy who was defending my cut and this sort of awful person in there. Paul Hirsch had cut Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back with George, and I, for one, would have liked to see the continuity continue, Lucasfilm editor Dwayne Dunham would say. But Richard wanted to use Sean, and Sean's a good editor, and that relationship between director and editor is a very, very close relationship. There's a certain kind of shorthand between them. In addition, Richard Marquand was very adamant about working with the actors. He provides this quote, I wanted to, as I was very much encouraged to get together with the actors. So I spent quite a bit of time with them, talking about their characters and where they thought they were going. Carrie expressed a concern that Leia had come off as this sort of boy in girl's clothing who marches up and down and shouts at everybody, and that maybe she could just mellow a little bit and have moments of despair. Carrie Fisher provides this quote, There are a lot of people who don't like my character in these movies. They think I'm some kind of space bitch. Richard Marquand corroborates this feeling. I said, that happened to coincide exactly with my feelings. In the last movie, the princess became such a bitch. She really was a drag. It became very boring. I was sure there was a lot more depth there than we could use and more comedy too. Turn her into more of a woman. Carrie said, oh yes, if only I could just break down. There were tears for a moment. Mark Hamill provides this quote about Richard Marquand. I liked Richard from the start. We discussed everything, from what we thought was going to happen to what we wanted to see happen. He was very enthusiastic and delighted at the prospect of making the movie. His energy matched my own enthusiasm for finishing the trilogy. As an actor, I wanted the storyline to be that Luke goes to the dark side and at the very end turns and comes back. Harrison Ford provides this quote about what he wanted his character to be like. I desperately wanted to die, Ford says. I thought it would give the myth some body, and that Han Solo, in fact, really had no place to go. He would have best served the situation by giving it the weight of sacrifice, but that was one thing I was unable to convince George of. George had this predisposition to happy endings. There's no less enthusiasm on my part because my idea didn't pan out. I just say that to illustrate the fact that I feel I am finished with the story. Richard Marquand corroborates this. He said I wanted to die, and he sort of persuaded me that there was a lot in what he was saying. If he could have some superheroic death, he could be out of the way so that Mark and Carrie can work out whatever it was they are going through. Well, you see, Harrison didn't know the truth of the story. He didn't know, and I couldn't tell him that Leia is Luke's sister. It wasn't until Harrison came to London that George and I showed him the script, Richard Marquand says. Harrison said, well, I understand. You know you love Luke. That's okay. Harrison used to say, "Give me as few lines as possible. I don't want any lines," Lucas would say. He was never the one to say, "I want my part to be bigger." Now, some interesting things about Richard Marquand are how he expresses his dislike for some of the artistic decisions that were made in The Empire Strikes Back. Richard Marquand provides this quote: "I hated the costumes of Empire. I couldn't believe the way Princess Leia was dressed in Cloud City. It was a disgrace. This beautiful girl in this terrible brown and white outfit. It was just a joke." The interesting thing about George is that he thinks the costumes should be neutral so that you really don't look at them. But you need to look at them if they're going to say something special, like Princess Leia's outfit on Jabba's barge. It's a great costume. It's outrageous to dress like that. I always thought that Carrie was a very sexy girl, so we came up with this thing. Well, she was very embarrassed to try it on the first time, which is not surprising. "I'd almost found 3PO a drag in Empire," says Richard Marquand. "I felt very awful that he'd been given dialogue to do because nobody could think of any way of filling in that space. He also represents the sort of character that I don't get on with very well, the sort of character that always aggravates me. You can have a few laughs at his expense, but at certain moments I think it went a little too far." It turned out that George agreed with me, which was nice because I wasn't sure whether he would. Now, one thing I want to state about this film is that I thought out of John Williams's work for the entire original trilogy, that his work for Return of the Jedi is my favorite. I really found that the music knocked it out the park. I thought it was very touching, especially the theme between Luke and Leia. I love that theme, and when I hear it, it is very emotional to me. It is some of the greatest music that I've ever heard composed in my entire life. Another thing that I want to say is that I love the way Darth Vader's voice sounds in this film, the way that it's mixed. The sound is just booming. When he speaks, it just booms through the speakers, and it really sounds like it's coming from the gut. And it's really good at creating that impending doom in his voice. They do an exceptional job. In addition, I also found the model work and compositing to look the best out of the entire original trilogy. And when it comes to Princess Leia's character, I really like how Leia is willing to get her hands dirty in this. And it's like she's going into the lion's den when she attempts to rescue the man she loves, Han Solo. I mean, keep in mind here that this is a princess. She is a princess. And I love to see her fighting in the trenches as well on Endor. It's so great to see this woman who is supposed to be almost like a diplomat, a princess, somebody that wouldn't get their hands dirty, right there fighting in the trenches, taking charge. It's a beautiful thing, and it really signifies a true depiction of female empowerment. Also, I love her reunion scene between Han and herself. It was very touching. And also, the reunion between Han and Chewie was great. There was great humor there, and the scene really exemplified the camaraderie between the two, the brotherly love. You can truly feel it. It was well executed. Now, when Luke is revealed as he enters Jabba the Hutt's palace, you see immediately that he is entirely different than the way he was in Empire Strikes Back and in A New Hope. He carries himself with this silent power. He's more confident and he has more presence. I also want to talk about a deleted scene that was included in the initial Blu-ray box set release, where we see Luke constructing his new green lightsaber prior to entry into Jabba the Hutt's palace. And basically, Luke is constructing or finalizing his new lightsaber, and while this is occurring, Darth Vader is calling out to him. I really thought it was a great scene, and I wouldn't have minded if it had made it into the final film because I really found it interesting. and somewhat important to see how Luke was able to create a new lightsaber after he lost his father's in his duel with Darth Vader. Now, in regards to the scenes between C3PO and R2D2, I really enjoy the humor. I love the dialogue. There is such wit, and the way that the scenes are written, it really makes the bittering between the two very humorous. And you always have to keep in mind that R2 basically has no dialogue. That is just Ben Burtt's sound mix with Anthony Daniels' dialogue, and somehow it all works. It's a great performance between Anthony Daniels' character and Kenny Baker and Ben Burtt's sound design, and somehow it all works to perfection. I also want to say that the animatronics and puppeteer work, especially in Jabba the Hutt's palace, is outstanding. Jabba the Hutt, who was operated by 4 to 5 different individuals, really was well executed. And it's so much better to see a Jabba the Hutt that is an animatronic rather than a CGI character like we saw in the special edition for A New Hope and in The Phantom Menace. Now, the art direction and set design in Jabba the Hutt's palace feels so seedy. It feels like a dungeon, and they do an outstanding job at creating an environment where there's danger and doom looming around every corner, and they do an outstanding job at creating this seedy underground environment. Now, I much prefer seeing Jabba the Hutt depicted in this manner rather than the way he was depicted in the special edition for A New Hope. It is better for us as the audience to have Jabba the Hutt revealed to us in this manner than the way he was revealed in the special editions for A New Hope. I feel like the way he was revealed in A New Hope makes him seem comical, and the way that Han Solo is able to get away with stepping on his tail just ruins the character for me. Because if you're not introduced to him like the way he was in the special edition for A New Hope, and you are just introduced to him in Return of the Jedi in this manner where he is revolting and intimidating and a scary character, it is way better. The New Hope special edition version of Jabba the Hutt ruins the character in my opinion, and I would prefer not to see him like that. Seeing him as this revolting, disgusting character and being done as an animatronic rather than a CGI character was so much better, in my opinion. Now, in regards to the Jedi Rocks musical number that was integrated into the film for the special edition version of Return of the Jedi, I don't like it. I'm not the biggest fan of it because it ruins the pacing. However, seeing the main singer with the elongated mouth and the lips being, I guess you want to say, recreated so that it looks less dated, it is appreciated. However, the new musical number, Jedi Rocks, just drags on for too long, and I'm not a fan of the music. I much prefer the music that was in the theatrical version. Now, one thing that the special edition version of Return of the Jedi did that I truly appreciate was bringing back the Twi'lek actress that played the dancer in Jabba the Hutt's palace to basically add more suspense to her scene. The way that they brought this actress back nearly 20 years later and the fact that she hasn't aged a day is just amazing. The editing is seamless. I really have to shower this with infinite praise right here. And it's so great to actually see her reaction to the Rancor in the special edition. We actually see her fall into the pit, and it creates this mystery and terror for this unseen Rancor to see her reaction, to see the terror on her face. That was such a great addition that the special editions brought to this film. Now, in regards to the stop motion work for the Rancor, I prefer this so much more than CGI, which would obviously be used today. And the matte painting work that's used looks amazing all throughout the film, especially in the scenes that try to create the hangars where the rebels consort and all that. Now, when the Rancor is killed, and the master cries like it was the death of a household pet. I found that scene to be hilarious. Again, this film has some great humor that is not too over the top, and I really appreciate that. Now, despite Marquand being hired as director, the situation was much different than the situation was on The Empire Strikes Back with Irving Kershner. Lucas would have a much more active role in the filming process. Sometimes Marquand appreciated this, and at other times it proved difficult for a young and inspiring upcoming director to have to constantly confer with the producer, who was also the writer. This quote by Richard Marquand reflects on this. We had been meeting daily. George was already having absolutely no time to rest. But I had warned him that that was the way I wanted to work. I just said, look, George, if I'm going to do this properly, you've got to give me your time. I mean, he hadn't necessarily planned to be in London at the shoot, but I said, you've got to be there. I like my producer around, and you're more than the producer. You wrote this goddamn thing, so let's get it right. Richard would come in only at 12 or even 1:30 p.m. during pre-production at Elstree because he didn't understand a lot about the building of sets and the preparation, Kazanjian would say. Richard didn't have that much to do, so I had called George before we started filming and said, George, you better plan on staying the entire time. Eventually, he did stay the entire time, and really there was never a time when George was not on set. I keep an open mind because movies are made by groups of people, not individuals, Richard Marquand says. It's a craft, not really an art. To help write the film, George Lucas rehired Lawrence Kasdan, who was paramount to the success of The Empire Strikes Back. I was surprised to find myself writing Return of the Jedi because I was already a director and I had no intention of writing for anyone ever again, Kasdan would say. But George asked me as a favor, and he'd already been so helpful to me in my career, not just on Raiders of the Lost Ark, but in helping me get Body Heat made. The process was the same for Jedi as Empire. We already were on a speeding train, Kasdan would say. There were designs and pictures of things before I even started writing. But when I came up to Marin, George was relieved because somebody was going to do the part that he hated, so he could concentrate on the parts that he loved, which was to design and produce. Larry took my script and rewrote it, and then I took his script and rewrote that, Lucas would say. And then he was working to take my script and rewrite that. To me, that's a good way of working. Another important thing to note about the approach to the making of Return of the Jedi was that there was a significant emphasis on expediency that would become a staple for George Lucas moving forward, when compared to how The Empire Strikes Back and the original Star Wars was made. This will be especially apparent when he makes the prequel trilogy. The following quote by Mark Hamill illustrates this expediency during the making of Return of the Jedi. We went back to that smash and grab technique, which was also used for Raiders of the Lost Ark. The energy generated when you get that kind of rhythm going is terrific. They say, okay, we can't spend all day on this. Do another take, and if we can't get it, let's move on. Rather than slapdash, the technique creates its own momentum. That kinetic energy made Star Wars. The pace on Empire Strikes Back was more leisurely. Also, Yoda and the technical problems slowed it down. We were over schedule almost 6 weeks, which added to a lot of the budget. George was very unhappy. With Jedi, he felt we should return to the Star Wars style. Just go, go, go. Now, during the writing of the film, many ideas were brainstormed and some were ultimately abandoned during the writing process. The most important thing that had to be addressed was the other that was mentioned in The Empire Strikes Back and Leia being Luke's sister. Now, one interesting thing that I'd like to add here is that this whole notion that George Lucas had everything planned out from the beginning, especially in regards to Leia being Luke's sister, just isn't true. In an interview with Alan Dean Foster, author of the novelization for A New Hope, George Lucas discusses the possibility of killing off Leia. Foster discusses, the point is, at the end of the picture, the impression I get, and I am still an outsider to this film, is that the princess is the princess and she doesn't take anybody. It leaves Luke feeling disappointed because he was interested in her, and she is completely unattainable at the end of the picture. She's just as divorced from Luke and Han as the other generals standing up there in the throne room, but Luke is not. Luke wants her. That's the impression I get. When she's standing up there hanging his medallion around him, she doesn't try to kiss him or anything. Lucas responds to this. Well, another thing we could do is go one step beyond the simple and move into the love story plot, where you have them kind of vying for each other. She is a spry little snappy kind of girl, and he's sort of liking her. And in the process of the movie, they fall in love and have a wonderful relationship, and in the end, she gets killed. It's one of those tweaked ideas, but it's one of those things that works. What I wanted to do when we were shooting the other movie is have the princess run off with the Wookiee, but it sounds perverted. I think that somebody else has to be killed. Lucas says, I wouldn't mind killing her off. So there we have George Lucas considering the possibility of killing off Leia and contemplating on the romance between Leia and Luke. Now, this obviously is incestuous in hindsight now that we know that Luke and Leia are related, but the point is that George Lucas did not have everything planned out from the beginning. He did not know when he was making A New Hope and maybe even halfway during The Empire Strikes Back that Luke and Leia would be related and that Leia would be the other that was discussed by Obi-Wan and Yoda. Another quote by George Lucas offers some details in regards to him contemplating the future of Leia's character. It's one thing to have Darth Vader tell Luke he is his father, but it's another thing to have Luke tell Leia that she's his sister and that Darth Vader is their father. That really gets hard to swallow, Lucas would say. That discussion is one of those scenes you never want to have to write. It's a real challenge to come up with dialogue that is sincere and believable. I'd have laughed on camera if Mark had told me for the first time on camera, Carrie Fisher says. It would have been like, Carrie, your dad isn't Eddie Fisher, Hitler is. Decades later, she would add, thinking for the first film, so this is my father who tortured me in that little room, but this is George, and this is the kind of amazing fairy tale myth that he's constructed. It's like opera, and we accept it because we enjoy the relationships. Carrie Fisher further adds, at the time, Fisher regretted not having taken maybe an extra beat or two during the scene with Mark to create more emotion, but with George, it's always faster and more intense. Now, I have to agree with Carrie Fisher's criticisms for that pivotal scene where Luke reveals to Leia that they are related, they're brother and sister, and that basically she is Darth Vader's daughter. I really feel like they did not give enough time for this scene to sink in, to marinate. I wanted more of a reaction, especially from Leia, with this newfound knowledge that she is the daughter of one of the most evil persons in the galaxy. I really felt like the scene was rushed, despite it being beautiful at the same time with John Williams' epic score, Luke and Leia's theme playing. It was a very touching scene, but I felt in the end it could have been 100 times better, even though it was great nonetheless. Now, in regards to the sail barge action sequence, I found it to be amazing. This is a truly timeless sequence where we get to see Luke as a full-fledged Jedi. He's confident, he has no doubts, and I really like how the fighting that he exemplifies is unrefined and a little sloppy, but there is a passion behind his fighting style. And this is because Luke is having to learn things from scratch with no guidance, no holocrons, no books, no Jedi temples. I really found this scene to truly illustrate what it means to be a swashbuckling fantasy film. Now, when Leia kills Jabba the Hutt, it really symbolizes her killing the individual that sexually objectified and degraded her. She uses the chains of her own enslavement to kill him. Now, in regards to the Sarlacc pit, I think that the Sarlacc pit and the special edition version of Return of the Jedi feels more like a life form in the ground. Because in the original version, it just feels like there's a hole in the ground, that there's not really something that is alive down there. Now, the exchanges between Han Solo and Lando were hilarious, well executed, and well acted by Billy D. Williams and Harrison Ford. It's great to see them together as friends rather than as backstabbers as was depicted in The Empire Strikes Back. I really love the camaraderie that they have going on here. Now, in regards to Boba Fett's presumed death, it totally was underwhelming, and one of the disappointing things about this film, there is an excerpt from George Lucas somewhere where he says he was trying to go with this whole blind samurai thing because Han Solo was blind from being in the carbonite freezing for so long, and that when he accidentally makes Boba Fett's jetpack go haywire and then ultimately he falls into the Sarlacc pit, that he was going for this blind samurai thing. But I think he honestly failed in that regard because the scene comes across too wacky and accidental. If it had been Han Solo basically going one-on-one with Boba Fett, standing up to him, and not having it being depicted as an accident, then yes, there totally would have been this whole like blind samurai, blind fury thing going on. But I really think that the scene doesn't come across like that in any way possible. In the following quote, Richard Marquand talks about filming the Jabba the Hutt sequences. You have to be aware when you're playing the scene that the person inside is on the verge of suffocation, Marquand says. So I think without any question, the hardest scene in every way was Jabba's palace. It was a very, very crowded set. It was incredibly hot. There were a lot of extras and a lot of crew, and nobody could take a break. So everybody ended up on the set all the time. Between takes, the noise was infernal. I used to go crazy. David wasn't really able to control people. It was just agony. It was hell. Carrie loved Jabba. She just adored him, says Richard Marquand. Her scenes with Jabba are terrific, but the guys inside couldn't pull the chain properly because of the three-fingered hand, so I asked him to try to hold it, and Carrie had to lean forward to keep the chain taut. She would say, "Hey, pull the chain, pull the chain. I want to feel that I'm really being captured." Now, during the filming of Return of the Jedi, a scene that had so much work implemented into it that was ultimately abandoned was a sandstorm scene in which our heroes were reunited with one another. Richard Marquand provides the following quote about this challenging scene that was ultimately abandoned. The sand was a mixture mostly of vermiculite, an industrial use polyester type grain, with a very light talcum powder, which is terrible, Marquand says. I hope to God it's not carcinogenic, because it certainly gets everywhere. It was some awful broken cork substance that goes right into your lungs. Sand doesn't look like sand on film, so they use cork. We all wore white paper overalls and colossal goggles so nobody knew who anybody else was. We spent the whole morning tapping each other on the shoulder saying, "Who are you? Forget it. You're not who I want. Where's my cameraman?" We eventually wrote our names on our backs. It was really torturous shooting that sandstorm scene, says Hamill. They threw Fuller's Earth in front of big fans and they got into my eyes and nose. It was awful. Now, ultimately, this sandstorm scene was cut from the film, but it was included as a deleted scene on the Blu-ray release for the 6-film saga. And one thing about this deleted scene is that there is a kiss between Luke and Leia. And whether there is a romantic thing going on there in between this scene where there's a kiss, it's kind of ambiguous. But my opinion is that even though Luke doesn't know that Leia is his sister at this point in the film or in this scene, that Luke is over Leia. He is focused on the Jedi path and he has bigger fish to fry and other priorities in mind. Now, in J.W. Rinzler's The Making of Return of the Jedi, there is an excellent transcript of the brainstorming and writing process that took place between George Lucas, Richard Marquand, Howard Kazanjian, and Lawrence Kasdan. Some of the ideas that were considered were the inclusion of Had Abadan, the dreaded imperial capital at the very heart of the Galactic Empire, which ultimately would end up being Coruscant in the Timothy Zahn Heir to the Empire trilogy novels and in the prequel trilogy. Other ideas that were considered but ultimately abandoned was a subplot involving Moff Jerjerrod conspiring with Palpatine against Darth Vader, Leia organizing work on two big rebel guns intended to be fired at the Empire, a battle between Yoda and Palpatine, and a scene in which Han penetrates the Endor moon's defense shields with the Falcon using light speed, an idea that was reintroduced in the film The Force Awakens. In the following discussion, the creators talk about the possibility of killing off one of the main protagonists. Kasdan: no, I'm not. I'm trying to give the story some kind of an edge to it. Lucas: I know you're trying to make it more realistic, what is what I tried to do when I killed Ben, but I managed to take the edge off of it. And it's what I tried to do when I froze Han. But this is the end of the trilogy, and we have already established that there are real dangers. I don't think we have to kill anyone to prove it. Kasdan: no one has been hurt. Lucas: Ben and Han, they've been hurt. Luke got his hand cut off. Kasdan: Ben and Han are fine. Luke got a new hand 2 cuts later. Lucas: by killing somebody, I think you alienate the audience. Kasdan: I'm saying that the movie has more emotional weight if someone you love is lost along the way. The journey has more impact. Lucas: I don't like that, and I don't believe it. Kasdan: well, that's all right. Lucas replies, I have always hated that in movies. When you go along and one of the main characters gets killed. This is a fairy tale. You want everybody to live happily ever after and nothing bad happens to anybody. Kasdan: I hate it when characters get killed too. Lucas: you do? I do, Kasdan replies. Lucas states, I resent it, and I resented it when I was a little kid. I would watch and there would be these 5 guys and one of them would be the funny clown and halfway through one of them gets killed. Why did they kill the lead? He was the best character. Marquand states, I felt that about Ben the first time I saw Star Wars. Kasdan: but that one worked like crazy. Lucas states, yes, I know, but we've done that. The same thing with Han. The biggest reaction we got was when people asked, how can you leave the movie half-finished? Well, the main thrust of this one is to have fun. Kasdan: all our material here is not fun. Lucas states, well, I know we've got the serious side. Kasdan replies, we have a lot of grim stuff here. Lucas says, well, that's why we have to concentrate on the fun. Kasdan replies, there isn't much fun stuff. There's the Jabba stuff. Lucas says, that's fun. And the Ewok stuff, and that's it, Kasdan replies. Lucas states, there are 3 parts to the movie. Jabba, the Ewoks, and Luke, and the Emperor. Luke and the Emperor are not fun, and the other 2 are. I think that we can roll along with the fun parts and still have this undercurrent of a fairly serious study of father and son, and good and evil. The whole concept of the original film is that Luke redeems his father, which is the classic fairy tale. A good father, bad father, who the good son will turn back into the good father. We can have a serious line and still have a fairly light film. The whole point of the film, the whole emotion that I'm trying to get at the end of this film is for you to feel real uplifted, emotionally, and spiritually, and feel absolutely good about life. That is the greatest thing that we can possibly ever do. Now, I thought that the introduction of Emperor Palpatine and his arrival was horrific and scary. I thought that the makeup effects were excellent, and I like how it looks so much more organic when, say, in comparison to Revenge of the Sith, the makeup in Revenge of the Sith. Here, it looks like his flesh is way more organic, and you can really see the flesh decaying. And even Darth Vader is afraid of Palpatine. And I thought it was a great setup when the Imperial officer is terrified that Palpatine will be arriving to oversee the construction of the second Death Star. Now, in regards to the casting of Palpatine, Alan Webb was the first choice for Emperor, but declined because he got the flu. Now, Richard Marquand recollects on this process for casting the important role of Emperor Palpatine. I can tell this story because I don't lie to actors, says Marquand. I used to be an actor, and I know that they prefer the truth. They know you were considering 30 people for one part, so I was able to be quite straightforward with Ian and say, look, actually, I was right in the first place. It's better to have a young man who can carry this role, and Mr. X has dropped out. So I would really appreciate if you would play the part. And Ian said, yeah, I'd love to. Richard Marquand gave me a tape of the Emperor from The Empire Strikes Back and said, if you can get your voice fairly close to what Clive Revel was doing, George might let you keep it, McDermott says. I was astonished to hear that because I didn't realize that I wouldn't be creating the voice myself. I said, Clive Revel is great, but he didn't really know the character he was playing. He was in the studio probably for a morning and an afternoon, if that. And now that I can see the Emperor's face, I think he's going to sound quite different, Richard said. Just do what you think should be right and let's hear it. His creation of the Emperor's voice came naturally. When I saw the face in the mirror, I thought, my God, it looks like Somerset Maugham, who's turned into a toad. So the voice became a combination of English upper class and trying to sound like a toad. I thought it had to come from somewhere deep down. I've always been fascinated by Japanese actors, a number of whom can speak from their stomach. I don't actually do that, but I thought if I could get down there. The Emperor uses the word friend a lot, and I thought he must think that is the most despicable thing that a human being could do, to form friendships, which is something that is completely alien to him, McDermott would say, because he has spent his life destroying other people, so I just thought, I'll focus on that word and make it a hate word from the Emperor's point of view. Now I thought Yoda's death and his final moments together with Luke was very touching and well acted. John Williams' score was excellent, and Yoda totally doesn't feel like a puppet, and this is due to the collaboration between Frank Oz and Mark Hamill. And it really feels like I'm watching a family member die right here. And when Yoda says, there is another Skywalker, pass on what you've learned, it really creates a sense of intrigue and mysteriousness. Now, when Luke talks to Obi-Wan, there is a total foreshadowing here that Vader is going to use the knowledge that Leia is Luke's sister against him, which ultimately takes place during the final showdown between Luke and Darth Vader. Now, in this scene, we have an extensive amount of retconning going down because Obi-Wan has to explain to Luke Skywalker why he quote-unquote lied. Now, during the filmmaking process, and if we scrutinize the filmmaking process, we know that George Lucas and the writers turned this into a lie, but it's obviously just what happens when you write yourself into a corner when you make things up as you go along, which is part of the filmmaking process. So despite what George Lucas likes to insist that he had everything made up from the very beginning, as we've been chronicling through these original trilogy analysis videos, we can see that that's not true. So Obi-Wan Kenobi says that what he told Luke initially in the original Star Wars film was his outlook from his point of view, and that he didn't necessarily lie when he told him that Darth Vader killed and betrayed Luke's father, because he's differentiating between Anakin, the good man, and Darth Vader, the evil persona that he would adopt once he betrayed the Jedi. Now, some important details regarding this sequence would make their way into canon at the time through the novelization of Return of the Jedi until they were retconned and contradicted in the prequel trilogy. In the novelization, Ben tells Luke, "When I first knew him, your father was already a great pilot, but I was amazed how strongly the Force was with him. I took it upon myself to train him as a Jedi. I thought that I could instruct him just as well as Yoda. I was wrong. My pride had terrible consequences for the galaxy." Now, that last line was omitted from the film, but I find it very telling because here it shows that Obi-Wan Kenobi's deficit as a person, as a character, are what led to the downfall of the Jedi, his pride. Continuing this, Ben says, "When your father left, he didn't know your mother was pregnant. Your mother and I knew he would find out eventually. But we wanted to keep you both as safe as possible. So I took you to live with my brother, Owen, on Tatooine, and your mother took Leia to live as the daughter of Senator Organa on Alderaan. Now, here are some important details that have forever been changed because of the prequels. This dialogue right here shows that initially Uncle Owen was Obi-Wan Kenobi's brother, and that Padme, or Anakin's wife, was alive when the twins were born, and that she personally took Leia to live as the daughter of Senator Organa on Alderaan. Another thing this dialogue reveals is that it seems that Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin's wife purposely hid the kids from Anakin. He had no idea that she was pregnant, which is totally contradicted in the prequels. Now, another thing that is telling about this dialogue is how Obi-Wan Kenobi knew of the pregnancy, but Anakin did not. And from this, we can take away that initially there was no rule that Jedi could not have families or that had to hide their marriages. I find this aspect to be very interesting. Now, additional dialogue from Obi-Wan Kenobi that's in the novelization reveals a somewhat different version regarding how Anakin became Vader. "You should not think of that machine as your father. When I saw what had become of him, I tried to dissuade him, to draw him back from the dark side. We fought. Your father fell into a molten pit. When your father clawed his way out of that fiery pool, the change had been burned into him forever. He was Darth Vader, without a trace of Anakin Skywalker, irredeemably dark, scarred, kept alive only by machinery and his own black will." Also, some of Anakin's thoughts are explored as Vader dies in the novelization. "There were memories he wanted none of. Not now. Memories of molten lava crawling up his back. No, this boy had pulled him from that pit. Here, now, with this act, this boy was good." Now, regarding the death of Yoda, director Richard Marquand provides this quote. "All kinds of things came up," Marquand says. "It was a very stimulating time. We made a huge number of changes. It seemed to us that there were too many lead personalities just in terms of sheer directing, gads of people around the whole time. So Larry and I said bluntly to George, 'You've got to kill somebody,' Larry said with a smile. 'Well, let's kill Yoda,' I said. 'I don't think that would be a very good idea. That would upset a lot of people, Lucas said. And Kazdan replied, yeah, that's why I said it, to upset somebody. So this started to get flippant, and then we slowly began to realize that with the fans out there, that it was very hard to actually kill anybody. Now I find that quote very illuminating because it shows that the idea to kill Yoda came from Lawrence Kasdan and the director initially and not George Lucas. Now, another interesting observation that I've made is that in Return of the Jedi, Obi-Wan Kenobi wants Luke to essentially kill Vader, kill his father. But Luke shows that the ways of the Jedi are wrong because he chooses compassion and not to kill his father, which is an act of love that saved the galaxy. Luke, therefore, has grown beyond the old ways of the Jedi. The initial root teaching of the Jedi is that of passiveness and peace. But somewhere down the line, they became aggressors when they fought in the Clone Wars. And therefore, Luke brought the Jedi back to what they were meant to be, which is agents of peace. But there was a transformation here in regards to how the Jedi are because this agency of peacefulness is derived from the act of compassion, which the Jedi of the Republic, the Old Republic rather, would have viewed as an attachment. Now, a discussion among the creators from J.W. Rinzler's The Making of the Return of the Jedi elaborates more on the writing process regarding this aspect of the story. Marquand asks, why did Ben not tell Luke? George Lucas replies, in the early script, I wrote that he wasn't ready to be told. Marquand replies, well, I think that is true. If Luke had known, he wouldn't have become a Jedi and he wouldn't have been able to deal with it, Lucas replies. I think that is absolutely true, Marquand states. Lucas states, that's the most practical reason why. He probably wouldn't have learned in the same manner, Kazanjan says. For a lot of people, there's a big issue there, which we can't skirt around, George Lucas replies. The fact that Ben lied, Marquand says. The fact that Ben lied, but he didn't really lie. He didn't really lie because in the first film, he says that Vader betrayed and murdered his father, which doesn't necessarily mean that he killed him, but that the bad Vader half of the person betrayed the good part of the person, the Skywalker half. It's easily understood, Lucas says. Kazdan replies, the first movie is not as much of a problem as the second one, where he has every opportunity to tell him. Yes, I agree, Marquand says. You could get rid of all this, Kazdan replies. But I still tend to want to bring Ben into it. He's one of the main characters, and he's still a strong presence. I sort of agree with Larry that the best way to handle that is to let him stay in another world, and to say there is nothing more that he can do now, and that Luke is a Jedi now, and that his job is done. It could be a goodbye scene to Ben, which is, I am never going to appear before you again, George Lucas states. Kazdan says, you want to bring him shimmering back at the end? We can do that. They are guardian angels who are standing there. Luke has the power to see them, Lucas says. That's nice, that works. They become the Force. The concept is that when you die, your energy drains into the Force, which is made up of all living beings. We are just personifying it a little bit, which I think is alright. But the idea running throughout the whole trilogy is, first, he's given his father's sword, because his father lost it in the fight with Ben Kenobi. Ben cut his hand off, and Vader fell into the volcano. So Ben then pried the laser sword out of the hand and kept it for the son. So then, what the father did was cut his son's hand and laser sword off. And that was a way of severing the relationship between father and son. Not only did Luke lose his weapon and was castrated, but at the same time his father split that relationship. Luke was carrying his sword for his father. Now he is not doing that anymore. In this one, he's built his own. He has built his own laser sword. He is his own man. He is not a son anymore. He is an equal, George Lucas says. Now, I find that quote to be very insightful because I never looked at the film in that regard, which is that initially Luke was carrying his sword for his father, but in the end, he begins to carry his sword for himself. He is his own man now. He is not the son anymore. He is an equal. I love that. Now, one of the consequences as a result of making the story up as you go along is that you write yourself into a corner and things become a little murky. They're not so much continuity errors, but just questions that you have to ask yourself because now the film, the trilogy, is telling a story. And what I mean is, there's that question as to why didn't Darth Vader sense Leia when he was interrogating her in the original Star Wars if she was related to him, if she was essentially a Skywalker. Well, we all know the reason for that is because when that scene was conceived and when it was filmed, George Lucas had no idea that Leia was going to be Darth Vader's daughter. I just find the whole notion to be very interesting. Now, one of the few things that I dislike about this film is when Leia says, "Somehow I've always known," when Luke Skywalker reveals to her that they are related, that they are siblings, brother and sister. I feel like when she says, "Somehow I've always known," it just makes all that romantic tension that they had in the previous two films just totally more awkward. I don't know why. For the life of me, the writers chose to put that line in there. In fact, that would be the number one thing as a writer I wouldn't want the character to say. Somehow I've always known. So think about that. Did she know when she kissed Luke in The Empire Strikes Back? Did she know all those times there was this romantic tension between her and him in the previous two films? I really don't like that line. Despite this scene being beautiful, with John Williams' score playing and just the aesthetic of it all, it's very touching, but that one line is the thing I dislike the most about this film, more so than any of the Ewok stuff. Another important detail in this scene is when Leia remembers her mother. A lot of people have claimed that there's a continuity issue here in regards to Revenge of the Sith, and they blame Revenge of the Sith for just being a haphazard story for basically forgetting what Leia said in this film. However, in the novelization for Return of the Jedi, when Leia remembers her mother, the memories are from infancy. They're from her as a baby. So, for Leia to be able to remember her mother as an infant in Revenge of the Sith is totally possible. How is it possible? It's possible through the Force. Now, another thing that I like about this scene in retrospect, now that Revenge of the Sith is out, I like how Luke says there's still good in him. It almost echoes the sentiments of his mother, Padme, because she says the same thing when she dies about Anakin. There's still good in him. So even though the son never met the mother, it's like their feelings are echoing across time. I really think it's poetic. And yes, that's me overreaching, but I still appreciate it nonetheless. I also find the acting here when Luke says, "I have to save him." It's such great acting on Mark Hamill's part. It's so touching. Now, the speeder bike chase on the forest of Endor is one of my favorite action sequences out of the entire saga. It's definitely the best chase sequence. I prefer this more than anything in the prequels, more than the pod race, more than the chase through Coruscant, more than the chase in The Rise of Skywalker. This speeder bike chase is hands down excellent. The sound mix from Ben Burt is so great, and it feels so photorealistic, and there's an intensity that's unmatched in comparison to other action sequences in the Star Wars saga. There's just this great sense of urgency. Now, Dennis Murrin, one of the special effects supervisors from Industrial Light and Magic, used a Steadicam and basically walked through the woods and shot one frame every second and then projected it back at 24 frames a second in order to get this feeling and this aesthetic like you were going 100 miles an hour. And that scene where Luke falls off the speeder bike and uses his lightsaber to deflect the blaster bolts from the stormtroopers on their speeder bikes, that was so awesome and so intense. And I love the simplicity of the scene because you see things like that a million times over in the prequels. And just to see it once in this film, in this trilogy, gives it more power than constantly having to use the lightsaber and do these tricks over and over in the prequels. Less is more. This is a perfect example of that. Now, the way the Emperor can foresee all the events that are about to go down make him feel like an omnipotent devil. There's like this subtle hint of Vader's betrayal of Palpatine when Vader senses his son, but Palpatine doesn't. When he says his compassion will be his undoing. I love Ian McDermott's great acting, and he has such a screen presence. J.W. Rinzler's The Making of Return of the Jedi shows the discussion regarding the development of Palpatine among the filmmakers. Anakin Skywalker started hanging out with the Emperor, who at this point nobody knew was that bad because he was an elected official, George Lucas says. Was he a Jedi? Kasdan asked. No, he was a politician. He subverted the Senate and finally took over and became an imperial guy, and he was really evil, but he pretended to be a really nice guy. He sucked Luke's father into the dark side. Lucas said, "The Force was available to anyone who could hook into it?" Lawrence Kasdan asked. "Yes, everybody can do it. Not just the Jedi. It's just the Jedi who take the time to do it. Like yoga. If you want to take the time to do it, you can do it. But the ones that really want to do it are the ones who are into that kind of thing. Also, like karate. Also, another misconception is that Yoda teaches Jedi, but he is like a guru. He doesn't go out and fight anybody," George Lucas says. "A Jedi Master is a Jedi, isn't he?" Kasdan asked. "Well, he is a teacher, not a real Jedi. Understand that?" Lucas replies. "I understand what you're saying, but I can't believe it. I'm in shock," Kasdan says. "It's true, absolutely true. Not that it makes any difference to the story," George Lucas says. "You mean he wouldn't be any good in a fight?" Kasdan asked. "Not with Darth Vader, he wouldn't," George Lucas says. "I accept it, but I don't like it," Lawrence Kasdan replies. Well, anyway, Luke's father gets subverted by the Emperor. He gets a little weird at home, and his wife begins to figure out that things are going wrong, and she confides in Ben, who is his mentor. On his missions through the galaxies, Anakin has been going off doing his Jedi thing, and a lot of Jedi have been getting killed. And it's because they turned their back on him and he cuts them down. The president is turning into an emperor, and Luke's mother suspects that something has happened to her husband. She is pregnant. Anakin gets worse and worse, and finally, Ben has to fight him, and he throws him down into a volcano, and Vader is all beat up. Now, when he falls into the pit, his other arm goes, and his leg, and there is hardly anything left of him by the time the Emperor's troops fish him out of the drink. Then, when Ben finds out that Vader has been fished out and is in the hands of the Empire, he is worried about it. He goes back to Vader's wife and explains that Anakin is the bad guy, the one killing all the Jedi. When he goes back to his wife, Mrs. Skywalker has had the kids. the twins. So she has these two little babies who are 6 months old or so. So everybody has to go into hiding. The Skywalker line is very strong with the Force. So Ben says, I think we should protect the kids because they may be able to help us right the wrong that your husband has created in the universe. And so Ben takes one and gives him to a couple out there on Tatooine, and he gets his little hideout in the hills and he watches him grow. Ben can't raise Luke himself because he is a wanted man. Leia and Luke's mother go to Alderaan and they are taken in by the king there, who is a friend of Ben's. She dies shortly thereafter, and Leia is brought up by her foster parents. She knows that her real mother died, George Lucas says. Now, I love this version of events a lot more than what happened in Revenge of the Sith. So, here in George Lucas's initial explanation to the backstory of Darth Vader, we see that Luke and Leia were already born when Anakin fell into the pit. They were 6 months old, and he didn't know that they existed. And it wasn't until Obi-Wan Kenobi saw that Vader survived his injuries from falling into the volcano that the Jedi decided to hide Luke and Leia. Now, in reaction to George Lucas stating that Leia remembers her mother, Kasdan asks, she does know that? Yes, so we can bring that out when Luke is talking to her. She can say that her mother died when I was 2 years old. The other can be explained by Yoda or described by Ben. We could say that for Ben, George Lucas says. Ben doesn't even know about it, Kasdan says. Ben knows about it, George Lucas states. How come in Empire he says he is our last hope, and Yoda says, no, there is another, Lawrence Kasdan asked. She isn't trained, she isn't ready, and Ben wasn't thinking. Let's assume that Ben knows there is another, George Lucas says. Kazanjian replies, he has to. The other thing is, I think you can make Ben take the blame for Vader. I should have given him more training. I should have sent him to Yoda, but I thought I could do it myself. It was my pride in thinking that I could be as good a teacher as Yoda. I wish that I could stop the pestilence that I've unleashed on the galaxy. His burden is that he feels responsible for everything that Vader has done, George Lucas says. The Emperor doesn't have Jedi powers, does he? Marquand asked. Well, he is like Yoda. Yoda isn't a Jedi. The Emperor isn't a Jedi. Yoda has mystical powers, and it's the same thing with the Emperor. He's like the Grand Priest, but he's not chief of the tribe. Jedi are like chiefs. They are the warriors who go out and fight with their swords. The Emperor and Yoda are the priests, who are the spiritual chiefs. They have powers that are much stronger. Now, this discussion here reveals that initially anyone could become a Jedi. The Force was spiritual, there was no midi-chlorians, and I find that to be fascinating and much more preferred than the midi-chlorian count thing that we got in The Phantom Menace. I love the idea that anybody can access the Force if they try hard. What does Lucas says? He says it's like yoga, that you have to commit yourself, and I really find that interesting. Another interesting thing is that initially Yoda and the Emperor were beyond lightsabers. They were beyond fighting. They were better than the soldiers, the Jedi. They were like priests, and the Jedi, they were like chiefs. They were meant to be the warriors, but Yoda was initially like a guru. You were never going to see him fight with a lightsaber at this time in George Lucas's mind. And I really find that fascinating. The notion that Yoda and the Emperor were above all that. Their powers were so great that they didn't need to swing a lightsaber. Now, in regards to the Ewoks, I find them enjoyable, and I never really understood why some people outright abhor them so much. The Ewoks dying, that one scene where that Ewok dies and his friend tries to wake him up like he's still alive, only to realize that his close friend is dead was such a powerful scene to me as a child because it showed that death is a real thing in war. And it seems on the surface that the Ewoks are these cute little teddy bears, but that scene right there showed that the Ewoks are warriors. They are dying, they are sacrificing their lives to fight against the Empire. Now, the only thing that I didn't like was the Ewoks possibly cooking our heroes in that scene that I found was silly and ridiculous and was very unnecessary. And really, all it does is it just throws the momentum of the film off because not for a second do we, as the audience, believe that our heroes are going to die at the hands of the Ewoks through some kind of cookout. It wasn't that funny either, despite the whole C3PO appearing to be a deity floating in the air because Luke is using his force powers. That was humorous. But I kind of felt like the scene dragged on a little too long, and that's one of the few things that I dislike in regards to the Ewoks. Another thing is that maybe the Ewoks could have been more feral and savage in their depiction, but to me, that's a nitpick. However, I do like the traps that they use when they fight against the Empire because it signifies brains over muscle. The following quote from George Lucas illustrates some of the inspiration for the Ewoks. Originally, I started writing Star Wars because I couldn't get Apocalypse Now off the ground, Lucas says. When I was doing Apocalypse Now, it was about this totally insane, giant technological society that was fighting these poor little people. They have little sticks and things, and yet completely cow this technological power because the technological power didn't believe they were any threat. They were just a bunch of peasants. The original draft of Star Wars was written during the Vietnam War, where a small group of ill equipped people overcame a mighty power. It was not a new idea. Attila the Hun had overrun the Roman Empire. The American colonies had been able to defeat the British Empire. So the main theme of the film was that the Imperial Empire would be overrun by humanity in the form of these cute little teddy bears. Now, in regards to the second Death Star, it is a little redundant and it definitely takes away from this film. However, at least it was visually different than the first Death Star because it was incomplete. And this allowed for a really awesome action sequence where our heroes, Lando Calrissian especially, has to go literally to the core of the Death Star, which was awesome. Now, I was considering the notion that maybe the second Death Star could symbolize a returning to the beginning of the story, similar to how Luke has to return to Tatooine at the beginning of the film. It's like the hero has to return to where the story all began. The story goes full circle. The heroes return where they came from as changed individuals. And I think having the second Death Star there signifies that in a way. Now, the making of The Return of the Jedi was not without conflicts, as the following quotes will illustrate. Although she had apparently asked Marquand to soften Leia, the final result was perhaps too far in the other direction. Carrie Fisher says, I didn't understand the character. I couldn't get into the swing of things, so I couldn't find my way into the character fast because she was different. All of a sudden, I was someone who loves you, and all that stuff. My hair was down, and I'm wearing this hippie dress. I felt like a Barbie doll, and I got insecure. I felt really uncomfortable. James Marquand, Richard Marquand's son, recollects. Dad was absolutely exhausted, but he used to say that he'd direct in his sleep. He'd go to bed and spend the whole night thinking he was still making the film. He was that engrossed in it, but extremely positive. Production designer Norman Reynolds states, he was intimidated by George. What added to the tension was the fact that Empire had gone over budget and over schedule, and George was determined that the third one would not. So he was on set all the time, and whatever Richard did, he, in a way, had to run it by George. Because we had a good relationship and I liked Richard, he was a good chap, I said to him, you just have to get through this and you'll be famous. You'll have made it, really. The film will be a huge success, so just consider yourself to be fortunate in that regard. George was on set all the time, says Anthony Daniels, and it was confusing sometimes because we have a director, but I think he was a little insecure in his role. It can't be easy to direct somebody else's brainchild, so I worked out who I needed to speak to get the information that I needed to play the role. Only once did I get conflicting directions, said Carrie Fisher. When I came into Jabba's throne room disguised as a man, Richard told me to stand like an English sentry. Then George walked in and said, Carrie, you're standing like an English sentry. You want to be more swashbuckling. Co-producer Robert Watts states, George came and he never left. Richard couldn't grasp it and George was concerned, so he never left. I wish Richard had asked me for help. He never did. The first day of shooting, I went into his office before we went on the set and I said, don't forget, Richard, we're all here to help you. But it's quite possible he felt too vulnerable. It's a tricky one to be in, particularly as a director, because I can remember Richard was ducking and diving, if you see what I mean, trying to take in what George said and make it sound like it was his idea as well. He did the wrong thing when trying to become one of the members of the club, Carrie Fisher would say. He would try to assert himself, but certainly not ingratiate himself. So then it would be like, I'll show you who's boss. He would sort of be grand and very British and very grand. Mechanical effects supervisor Kit West states, George was on his shoulder the whole time, and Richard many times had to save face and sort of put his foot down a bit because he saw himself as, the director, but it's nothing unusual, believe you me. My patience isn't bad, but there are two things I can't stand, Marquand says. One is if people don't tell me beforehand when they know things are going wrong. Everything else you can forgive. Then the other thing that really does drive me crazy is when people don't do what I tell them to do. But on the whole, that didn't happen very much. These movies are George's movies, and we are all just instruments in making them, editor Dwayne Dunham would say. But sometimes I felt bad for Richard, because George would ask to see his shot list. A director usually shows up in the morning with a list of shots he needs, and for some, it's very private. You take a director who'd only done Eye of the Needle, still a young guy who came out of TV, and I think he was overwhelmed with what he was stepping into, co-producer Bloom would say. I remember that feeling of his being overwhelmed, being at ILM, in the meetings around George, learning, but not being the kind of director who could step in and direct the movie. Kirshner, on the other hand, was a very different director. Kirsch was an old pro. He had done lots of movies with lots of big actors and had been around the studio system and had worked with really big time producers. Kirshner just said, yeah, been there, done that, I know what to do. I'm going to make a movie. And if I don't understand the visual effects, I've got these great guys at ILM. Richard, in his previous films, would have worked it out and would have shot the scene the way he worked it out, his wife Carol Marquand would say. But George has a slightly different approach, and so he would encourage Richard to use multiple cameras sometimes. It was much more of a documentary method. Take it back to the cutting room and see what you've got. So there was a little exasperation when George would insist that a scene be shot with 3 cameras and Richard had already worked it out. He found a lot of it pettifogging, shooting so much coverage. He felt he'd been hired to make these choices beforehand, to visualize it, to choose his setups and to cut them together. So he was frustrated at times and found what was going on incomprehensible. I impose my will a little bit, as I have a tendency to do, whether I'm just in a writer's conference or whether I'm directing, Lucas would say. It's just that I knew in the end how we were going to deal with all this. I knew we couldn't go plodding through with a single camera shoot. I knew there were some areas where we have to use multiple cameras because the scenes were too complex. And I love shooting with multiple cameras. I like to be able to cover myself. Richard was making the movie. I was speeding him along and at the same time doing it in ways that allowed us to get more footage and more options. Multi camera is very, very hard with the cameramen. They hate it. They always scream bloody murder, but in the end, it turns out fine. The trouble with multi camera is that they all have to be set up, editor Sean Barton adds. It slows down everything. It was this obsession of George's, having several cameras on every side, which affects where you're going to put the main camera. Because if you're not careful, you're shooting the other cameras. And if you're having 3 or 4 cameras on a scene, they have a descending order of importance. The first one is the main one. Often, a second one is doing some useful stuff, but the third and fourth ones are very rarely doing anything interesting. But what they do is they get in the way of the other two. You find later that when you're trying to cut them, that they've crossed the line. So you can't use that footage without flopping it, which becomes very complex indeed. Barton also describes Harrison Ford's disposition towards director Richard Marquand. Harrison didn't take to Richard at all. He didn't get on with him. Carrie Fisher also states, it was like Richard was afraid of Harrison or respected Harrison, but he certainly didn't respect, as far as I could make out, too many other people. But he was great to Harrison, who's intimidating, you know? He's a movie star in a way that I'm not, in a way that Mark isn't. And Richard kowtowed to him. Now, to kowtow to him and treat us badly, Harrison didn't like that. That was my impression. Maybe I'm wrong. Now, despite these quotes, things weren't all bad, obviously, on the set. I actually had a great time working with Richard, George Lucas would say. We had a cooperative relationship. So if I just said, do it like this and don't worry about it, he was curious about what was going to happen, but we didn't spend a lot of time trying to reinvent the wheel. Films like this operate on a lot of faith. In this case, the director had to have a lot of faith that all the missing pieces would miraculously appear in post production. I think directing Return of the Jedi is rather like being a famous conductor, says Richard Marquand. You are given this fabulous orchestra, full of the most brilliant musicians that you could want in the world. The guy who wrote the music is listening. He is available for any problems you have to say. Well, if you play the third bar a little faster, you didn't compose the music. Some other guy did, and he's in the next room. Return of the Jedi was more of a return to the smash and grab technique, which I think works well in Star Wars and Raiders of the Lost Ark, Mark Hamill says, who preferred that method to Irving Kershner's slower pace on set. You make do with what you have, and a certain kind of kinetic energy emerges, which sets up a rhythm that works. Some of the ideas that were intended for the original Star Wars film were incorporated into Return of the Jedi, which was initially called Revenge of the Jedi, but the title was changed because the idea is that a true Jedi does not take revenge. One idea that was recycled from the original rough draft of the original Star Wars film was the idea of an indigenous group of technologically disadvantaged people fighting against the technologically advanced empire, which were originally going to be the Wookiees. The following quote states, "The Wookiee planet that I created for Star Wars was eventually turned into the Ewok planet in Jedi. I basically cut the Wookiees in half and called them Ewoks. I didn't make Endor a Wookiee planet because Chewbacca was sophisticated technologically, and I wanted the characters involved in the battle to be primitive. That's why I used the Ewoks instead, George Lucas says. Now, I thought it was great to finally see Lando Calrissian get his due and be a leading protagonist, taking on a pivotal role in the final battle against the Empire. I thought that was awesome. Now, in regards to the iconic character Admiral Akbar, it was great to find out that Richard Marquand played a pivotal role in his creation. There was a great moment in one of those sessions, Marquand remembers. George suddenly said to me, "Who's going to play Admiral Akbar? I just decided he should be a creature, so you can pick out Admiral Akbar." I said, "George, I think this should be your decision. He's one of your new characters here." And he said, "No, you choose." So I picked the most delicious, wonderful creature out of the whole lot. This great, big, wonderful calamari man with a red face and eyes on the side. I think it's good to tell kids that good people aren't necessarily good looking people and that bad people aren't necessarily ugly people. One or two people around the table, who shall be nameless, said they thought it was a terrible idea. People are just going to laugh when they see this guy. Now, that is such a great quote, and I love the fact that director Richard Marquand played a pivotal role in how Admiral Akbar was designed. He was the one that chose the visual concept of the character, and I think that is awesome because he played a great contribution to an iconic character in Star Wars lore. Now, some critics of George Lucas state that he is not a very good editor, but co editor Steve Starkey states this: Dwayne was doing a bunch of the Ewoks and Ewok battle scenes, and George, whatever he decided to do, he would just do it, and he was looking over everybody else's shoulder. Marsha would show him what she was doing, and George would give comments, or Dwayne would. So, in addition to cutting himself, he was the principal editorial vision on the movie. Now, in regards to Marsha Lucas's role, Steve Starsky adds, Marsha would edit a lot of the emotional type scenes. Now, during the post production of the film is when Marsha Lucas and George Lucas's relationship was straining. Marsha Lucas states, I felt that we had paid our dues, fought our battles, worked 8 days a week, 25 hours a day. I wanted to stop and smell the flowers. I wanted joy in my life. And George just didn't. He was very emotionally blocked, incapable of sharing feelings. He wanted to stay on that workaholic track, the empire builder, the dynamo. And I couldn't see myself living that way for the rest of my life. I felt we were partners, partners in the ranch, partners in our home, and we did these films together. I wasn't a 50% partner, but I felt I had something to bring to the table. I was the more emotional person who came from the heart, and George was the more intellectual and visual, and I thought that provided a nice balance. But George would never acknowledge that to me. I think he resented my criticisms, felt that all I ever did was put him down. In his mind, I always stayed that stupid valley girl. He never felt I had any talent. He never felt I was very smart, and he never gave me much credit. When we finished Jedi, George told me he thought I was a pretty good editor. In the 16 years of our being together, I think that was the only time he complimented me. Ouch, now that hurts. Now, in an interview with 60 Minutes, George Lucas states, It was very hard. The divorce kind of destroyed me. It did take me a couple of years to sort of unwind myself and come out of it. You didn't see it coming? Oh no, I didn't, George Lucas responds. You were happy, everything was fine, and there was another man, and you didn't know. George Lucas replies, 10 years younger than I was. It was one of those classic divorce situations. George Lucas's friend, Steven Spielberg, elaborates on the divorce. The divorce pulverized him. George and Marcia, for me, were the reason you got married. Because it was insurance policy that marriages do work, and it working together and living together and having understandings on many, many different planes. It does work. And when it didn't work, and when that marriage didn't work, I lost my faith in marriage for a long time. Marcia Lucas states, by the time George could afford to have a film facility, he no longer wanted to direct. After Star Wars, he insisted, I'm never going to direct another establishment type movie again. I used to say, for someone who wants to be an experimental filmmaker, why are you spending this fortune on a facility to make Hollywood movies? We edited THX in our attic. We edited American Graffiti over Francis's garage. I just don't get it, George. The Lucasfilm empire, the computer division, IOM, the licensing, and lawyers seem to me to be this inverted triangle sitting on a P, which was the Star Wars trilogy. But he wasn't going to make any more Star Wars, and the P was going to dry up and crumble, and then he was going to be left with this huge facility with its enormous overhead. And why did he want to do that if he wasn't going to make movies? I still don't get it. Marcia also states he was very bitter and vindictive about the divorce. Francis and Ellie Coppola used to have an Easter party out in Napa, and the first couple of years after the divorce, I used to get to see everyone, the Barwoods, the Robbinses, and then I stopped being invited. Years later, I ran into Ellie down in LA, and she said, I always wanted to tell you to explain that when George and Francis were working on Tucker, George asked him not to invite you because he was very uncomfortable around you. That really hurt. It's not enough that I'm erased from his life. He wants to blackball me too, with people who were my friends. It's like I never existed. Thomas Smith, IOM's general manager, states, we still had over 100 shots to go. One day, as I left the editing room, Marcia followed me outside. She looked very distressed, almost in tears. I asked her what was wrong, and she said she didn't know how IOM could possibly finish in time. I told her not to worry, that we were working day and night, 6 days a week. Everyone was tired, but giving all they had. I don't think she believed me. She worried we weren't aware of how serious the deadline was and said it was keeping her awake at night. How could we deliver more than 100 shots in only a few weeks when it had taken more than 6 months to finish the first 400? George Lucas states, if she was breaking into tears, it probably had nothing to do with the movie. The people who were working had no idea why these things were happening. Once the news was broken to the cast and crew that Marcia and George were divorcing, many people were devastated by the news. And again, as I stated in the initial introduction to this video, it's very unfortunate that George Lucas intended at the end of the making of Return of the Jedi to spend time with his family, to put aside Star Wars so he could spend time with his kids and with his wife, only for her to ask for a divorce halfway through the making of this film. It's very sad, and Marcia Lucas's contributions to the Star Wars trilogy cannot be denied. They cannot be underappreciated because she contributed so much. And I wish that things hadn't happened the way they did. I don't take any sides in this conflict because I am on the outside looking in. We are all on the outside looking in. The only thing that I wish is that Marcia Lucas get more appreciation and attention for her contributions to the Star Wars trilogy. And now that a significant amount of time has passed, I finally think that is happening. Time heals all wounds. Now, my favorite scene in the entire Star Wars saga is when Darth Vader looks into Luke's mind and his feelings betray the fact that Leia is his sister, and Darth Vader tries to provoke him and use this against him. And I just love this dialogue that's spoken right here and the execution of the line delivery by James Earl Jones and Mark Hamill's performance. And then when Mark Hamill gets furious and Luke starts to attack Vader and you hear John Williams' epic score playing, I get chills every time I see it, even when I think about it. When Vader is lurking in the shadows and Luke is hiding, and you can clearly see that he is scared. He doesn't want to fight his father. And he says, "Give yourself over to the dark side, Luke." And then he says, "A sister. So you have a twin sister. Your feelings have betrayed her too. If you will not turn to the dark side, then perhaps she will." And then Luke screams, like, "No!" And then this epic battle occurs, and it's short but sweet. And Luke basically defeats Vader. He cuts him down and he cuts off his hand. And then he stops and he looks at his own hand and sees the mechanical hand, the prosthetic hand that he had to replace the hand that Vader cut off. And he sees that he is becoming just like Darth Vader. And then, as he realizes this, he's able to reel himself back in. And he refuses to turn over to the dark side. And he says this to the Emperor. He says, "You failed. I am a Jedi, like my father before me." And then the Emperor begins to torture Luke. And as Vader sees the Emperor torturing his son, this ignites something inside of him. And I think in retrospect, if we incorporate the prequels into this narrative, I like to think that Vader's having flashbacks to that night when he betrayed the Jedi, when Palpatine was getting electrocuted and electrocuting, using Force lightning to electrocute Mace Windu, and he remembers that night when ultimately his life took a terrible turn, all in the name of love, his love for his wife. And then here we can see that this son of his that he never knew is showing compassion, is showing love for a father he never knew. And I think this ultimately is what touches Vader and why he chose to kill the Emperor and throw him off that balcony into that reactor. It's because Vader was touched by Luke's actions. And here, Luke transcends the Jedi right here. He improves upon the Jedi. He basically outdone all the Jedi teachings. And it's not that he contradicted them, but he proved them wrong. Because the Jedi of old, the Jedi of the old Republic, repressed emotion. But Luke used an emotion. He used the act of compassion, of love for his father. And this saved the galaxy when it touched Anakin, when it touched Vader. And he ultimately killed the Emperor because of this. So, right here, Luke did the most Jedi thing of all, because you have to remember that Obi-Wan and Yoda insisted that he defeat Vader, that he defeat Vader and the Emperor. They never encouraged them to use nonviolence or to use compassion. But Luke Skywalker transcended the Jedi of old by doing ultimately the greatest act of a Jedi ever, by being nonviolent, by being compassionate. And he did that. And ultimately, this act brought balance to the Force. And for me, that is balance. It's not about repressing emotion at the expense of being rigid and structured and orthodox. And it's also not about being passionate at the expense of abandoning a restraint. It's about balance. And I really feel that Luke saving his father through an act of compassion and bringing him back to the from the dark side through an act of love signified that, because it showed that emotions aren't bad and that relationships parental relationships, a relationship between a father and son, a love between a father and son. It's not a bad thing. And the Jedi viewed all that stuff as attachment, as weakness. And it came from a place of fear, if you think about it, because the reason why the Jedi forbade attachment is because they were afraid that if you had the power of a Jedi, if you had force powers and something went wrong because you were attached, you would use your powers for jealous motives, for selfish motives, and stuff like that, for evil, in other words. But ultimately, that's just a part of existence. Good versus evil, you cannot get rid of it. So to repress emotion in its entirety was wrong. And this is totally my thesis on this, but I really feel that way. And this is what I take away from this film when I watch it. Luke transcended the limitations of the Jedi that we saw in the prequels, and I think this is a beautiful story. And it really is a great morality tale. And I think Luke almost crossing over to the dark side when he cut his father's hand off makes him more accessible as a character because he's still flawed, even though he's compassionate. And if you compare this to other morality tales about resisting the dark side, for instance, if we compare this to the tale of Job, who was basically there was basically a bet between God and the devil said, if we take everything that this guy loves away from him, he will curse you. And that's exactly what happened. Job lost his family, he lost all his belongings, he lost his entire livelihood, and he never cursed God. And God was right about Job because God always felt that Job would be a faithful follower. Now, if we also have another comparison of Jesus, who was tempted by the devil when he was in the desert for days upon days, and the devil tempted him with all the world's luxuries, and Jesus resisted him. When you compare that with Luke, Luke feels more accessible when compared to, like, say, Job or Jesus, because they feel they're perfect. They didn't have any temptation. They didn't have any moments of weakness per se. And this is why I love this story so much because it resonates so much with everyday people because Luke is the perfect everyman. Now, let's talk about the special editions. Now, when George Lucas added the additional dialogue of Vader basically saying no and throwing the Emperor off the balcony, for me, I have mixed feelings about that because I can see why somebody would do that. Maybe they would think that it would create more of an emotional impact for the scene if they added some dialogue on there. But I grew up watching the scene with Vader making that maneuver, throwing the Emperor off the balcony silent. And I feel like even though there's an actor, David Prowse, in a mask, that him looking at his son getting tortured and then looking at the Emperor, and you can kind of see what's going on without having to hear any dialogue. In other words, Vader in that mask and David Prowse's mannerisms were enough to emote and convey emotion to the viewer of what was going on in his mind. When there is no dialogue present, I didn't need Vader to say no. No, I felt it. I felt that he was having second thoughts, and I felt that he was feeling pain at seeing his son being tortured by Palpatine. So I guess it's unnecessary, but at the same time, I can see why Lucas would put it in there. But it kind of feels like he's not giving his audience the benefit of the doubt to be smart enough to understand what Vader's feeling. So he's like, "Oh, I better have him say no. No." It was unnecessary. Yes, it was. But it's not the worst thing. I think Return of the Jedi special edition and all the changes that were made to this film completely butchered it. This one right here is the least worrisome or problematic out of all the changes. I will never watch the Blu-ray or 4K official version or Disney Plus version that's available, the special edition version. They butchered this film, man. They completely ruined it. It's the worst one. Everything from the Max Rebo Jedi rock scene, which is awful, and just putting Hayden Christensen at the end as a Force Ghost, which I completely disagree with vehemently, even though I have no problem with Hayden Christensen in Revenge of the Sith. I got no problem with that, man. But you just don't do that. To me, it just, you don't tamper with it like that. And just, I think that was just such a stupid change, even though I like seeing Coruscant and all the other planets, Tatooine. I like to see them partying and happy that the Emperor has been killed at the end of the special edition. I like that, but just putting Hayden Christensen in there and that whole Jedi rocks nonsense in Jabba the Hutt's palace really butchered this movie to me. And the reason why I disagree with the insertion of Hayden Christensen at the end as Anakin's Force Ghost is because Luke Skywalker wouldn't even know who that is to begin with. Because when he took Vader's mask off, he saw the face of the actor Sebastian Shaw's face. That's who I want to see. That's who Luke would recognize. But for him to have this look of recognition when he sees Hayden Christensen's face, it just makes no sense to me whatsoever. Now, the following quotes illustrate an interesting conversation between George Lucas, Lawrence Kasdan, and Richard Marquand regarding the final confrontation between Luke and Darth Vader. Lawrence Kasdan asked, "What is operating in Vader's head when he brings Luke to the Emperor?" What is operating in his head is the Emperor will turn Luke to the dark side because I can't do it, because I'm not strong enough. He will turn Luke and then I will be able to, Lucas says. Richard Marquand jumps in, join with Luke and destroy the Emperor. Lucas corroborates this. Join with Luke and eventually turn him to destroy the Emperor. Once he is on the side of the dark, then it will be easy. Then we are a team. Then we are father and son. But it's never spoken, Richard Marquand says. Lucas states Vader doesn't realize that the Emperor wants to replace him. Now, in regards to Anakin's reveal, Lucas states, "You can't be too realistic about it." "I'm sure it'll work," Kasdan states. "It has to be a real father. It's got to be like your father when the mask comes off. Otherwise, it doesn't work." The whole point is that he might have been able to live without all that stuff, but he would have been a weak pile of nothing. Now that he was on the dark side, he wanted to be greedy. He wanted to have all this. He relied on the machine. The whole machine thing becomes a partial metaphor for the dark side of the Force, which is machines have no feelings, George Lucas states. Is there any electronics or wiring just under the skin of the mask? Do we have to deal with that? Kazanjian asked. Well, we have to deal with it so that a 7 or 8 year old kid will say, "Gee, isn't that too bad about that man?" We have to elicit sorrow at this point, not repulsion. We want to make him as realistically screwed up at this point as possible without going too far. I mean, the truth of it is this. We went overboard on the whole thing on the last picture. It wasn't supposed to be that grotesque. As a matter of fact, you weren't supposed to see any of that at all. It was supposed to be a total silhouette. The core of all this thing is that the Emperor is the master and Vader is the apprentice, George Lucas states. Now, I found this conversation to be so interesting, and the revelation that we weren't really supposed to see the back of Darth Vader's head in The Empire Strikes Back in such a grotesque manner is very interesting, and that George Lucas feels that maybe Irving Kershner went too far overboard in depicting Vader as a grotesque monster, or basically inferring that he was. That's very interesting. And I agree. I'm glad that they went this route with the Anakin reveal that when you take off Vader's mask, he's a frail old man that almost could be like your father or my father. And this artistic choice made the film more accessible. It made the whole scenario more accessible. The whole son redeeming the father, son redeeming a family member. It made it more accessible on a universal level because now the audience feels like, hey, that could be my father. I thought that was an outstanding decision by George Lucas. Now, another important thing to note is that Lawrence Kasdan and Harrison Ford wanted a more bittersweet ending, and I'm glad that they didn't go that route. I'm glad that George Lucas stuck to his guns and insisted on the happy ending that we got. But a quote from Lawrence Kasdan reveals this. He states, I also felt someone had to go, someone had to die, and I thought it should happen very early in the last act so that you would begin to worry about everybody. We should sacrifice somebody. Harrison Ford states, I thought Han Solo should die. I thought he ought to go sacrifice himself for the other two characters. I said, he's got no mama, he's got no papa, he's got no future. He has no story responsibilities at this point. So let's allow him to commit self sacrifice. Now, I'm glad that they didn't go this route. I'm glad they didn't kill Han Solo. And it kind of shows the naivety or the ignorance of Lawrence Kasdan and Harrison Ford as far as where George Lucas wanted to take this story in the future. I mean, obviously, Kylo Ren didn't exist, but there was the son of Leia and Han or the daughter. We don't know at this point, but there were children, and they were the children of Han and Leia. So Harrison Ford was. I see that he wanted to create tension in the film by having his character die, but he was wrong as far as him saying that he's got no future because his character did have a future. He was just unaware of it. Now, the following quotes deal with the epic confrontation between Vader and Luke. Richard Marquand states, I had wanted that fight to be bigger than the fight in Empire. And then when George came, he said it doesn't have to be bigger because basically it can't be. George is very blunt. He said, it's just a couple of guys banging sticks against each other. Don't worry about that. He said it's bigger because of what's going on in their heads. He said that we actually needed some dialogue in the middle of that fun, and that Luke goes through three changes. One is just straightforward anger. The next is not wanting to fight and withdrawing. And then the last one is, you son of a bitch, okay, I'm going to kill you. So it's three different fights. Vader also knows that the Emperor is toying with Luke. He has been told by the Emperor, when he starts to strike me, you're going to have to take him out. If Vader doesn't block Luke's laser sword, the Emperor could just raise his hand, and that would be the end of it. Then Vader would be in trouble. Lord Vader, what happened to you? Did you not get your cue? So Vader knows what the Emperor is doing to the kid. Instead of Vader turning Luke to the dark side, maybe the Emperor can. Vader doesn't care who does it, because then the father and son can unite, says George Lucas. But Vader doesn't quite understand the Emperor's plot. The whole plot of the Emperor is to get Luke to turn to the dark side and become his apprentice by killing Vader. Vader doesn't quite understand that he's on the chopping block until he gets into that fight. He thinks that his job is to kill the kid, but of course he can't really kill the kid, and the Emperor knows that he can't really kill the kid. The Emperor is playing the two sides against each other to see which one wins. It's not until Luke cuts off his father's hand that it occurs to Vader what's going to happen here. He realizes, wait a minute, I've been set up. Then he also realizes that his son is what Vader was at one point, when Luke's choice was his choice. His son refuses to kill him, and that is such a revelation to Vader. It reminds him of what he once was, states George Lucas. He knows that if he gets into a laser fight with the Emperor, he won't win. He knows his son can't win. Neither one of them can beat the Emperor. Together they might. In the first sequel, he reveals that when he says, "Together we can rule the universe." That's still his plot in Return of the Jedi. It's just that his son has said, "No, I'm not going to do that." So that's a bit of a problem, Lucas adds. So Vader is not powerful enough to kill the Emperor, but he does so in a very unexpected way. He does it not out of thinking or fear. He does it out of the super energy of wanting to protect his son, out of compassion. Vader finally has compassion for his son and realizes that his life has been a sham, states George Lucas. The final resolution to the conflict between Vader and me is surprisingly not action fireworks as much as two characters confronting each other, says Mark Hamill, who found the duel among the more difficult scenes to shoot. George retreats from raw emotion. He sees it as more stylized, so the audience can read their own feelings into it, not communicating with their fathers or saying things they wish they'd said. There's no question that Luke is now an equal swordsman to Vader, adds Mark Hamill. But Luke isn't a sadist. He would never make Vader suffer, because I'm better at what a Jedi does than Darth Vader. So the question is, how do I resolve it? We were much more interested in the drama than in a long, flashy fight, states Mark Hamill. During the final confrontation, when Luke has Vader on the ground, the red lights of the elevator were design elements, but were also there specifically, Lucas would say. The color goes symbolically into the blood of the Father and Son, and a move toward hell, because this is where Luke is going to go to hell or not. The final casting decision, the big one, was Vader, says Richard Marquand. I had in my mind to choose one of the great English actors. I don't know why. I got some photographs, prepared a short list, and sent them off to George. He came back and said, "I think you're making a mistake. I think when that helmet comes off and you see the face of Lawrence Oliver or John Gilgalon, people are not going to be able to take it serious. I don't think you should know that man." I think that was a wise decision by George Lucas to go with a lesser known actor, Sebastian Shaw. Our most important makeup was also the most subtle, Tippett would write. Vader was designed to look as though he had been wounded in battle, with a large chunk of his cranium missing. Makeup appliances were engineered, not to cover the face with ghastly mutilation, but to justify why the man had to seek refuge in a mechanical body. Everybody concerned, director, producers, were watching that scene all the time with hawk eyes because it was so important, actor Sebastian Shaw adds. Richard Marquand directed the scene, but George Lucas was around all the time, keeping an eye on because, after all, Star Wars is his baby. And they were very careful, clearly. There was the huge Star Wars stage, but it was vast and it was empty. They had cleared it completely except for the absolute minimum of people. We worked fairly hard that day. The scene was so beautifully written that we never altered the dialogue at all. Now, watching Shaw as Vader gave Kazanjian an idea. George was terrific and would sometimes listen to suggestions, Kazanjian would say. So I said, when Yoda and Obi-Wan Kenobi are in that ghost effect at the end of the picture, why don't we have Darth Vader there? The next day he said, let's do it. And I felt good because I was contributing something to the film that George liked and accepted. Now, it's important to note that in one of the previous drafts, Anakin's Force Ghost was present at the end, but it's nice to know that Howard Kazanjian also contributed to the final decision in having him be there. Now, Return of the Jedi marks the end of the original Star Wars trilogy, and I think that this last act ended so beautifully. The redemption of Anakin Skywalker through the compassion of his son, through the love of his son, was beautifully written, and it turns the Star Wars trilogy into a beautiful morality tale that offers uplifting experiences to the audience. It's a feel good movie, and I really think that despite that this film has more flaws than, say, the original Star Wars or The Empire Strikes Back, this sentiment that is at the heart of this film makes it just as good as the other two films that came before it, in my opinion. I adore this film, and I love how this film turned the entire trilogy into a story about a son redeeming his father, a son believing that there was good in his father, when even his mentors, Obi-Wan Kenobi and Yoda, felt that the situation was hopeless. It was the act of a son loving his father, showing compassion to his father, who was thought too far gone, which saved the universe. Luke Skywalker transcended the limitations of the Jedi of old. And I think this is a beautiful morality tale and one of the best morality tales to exist. This marks the conclusion for my thesis for Return of the Jedi. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, and share. May the Force be with you. And last but not least, one love, people. Take care.